the military is much more interested in being warriors than the process of becoming warriors. Because what it takes to be fit enough to do something like that is consistent training over a long period of time.
Right.
That's not sexy. What's sexy is, hey guys, next Wednesday, we're going to throw down, regardless of how prepped we are. And if you were just mentally tougher, you would do it.
Part-Time Hitter is brought to you by Friendly Forces, a 501c3 nonprofit committed to helping reserve component members seamlessly integrate their military service with rewarding civilian careers. We connect them with employers who value their unique skills and critical role in national security and advise organizations how to become more reservist friendly. Check them out at www.friendlyforces.org. Friendly Forces is also brought to you by the Fratty Guard, a lifestyle brand for part-time hitters. Check them out at www.thefrattyguard.com and on Instagram at @thefrattyguard. All right, welcome to another episode of the Part-Time Hitter podcast, brought to you by Friendly Forces and the Fratty Guard. I'm your host, Eric Evans, and today I'm joined by Alex Morrow and Drew Hammond of Holistic Health and Fitness, aka H2F. I believe that's strictly an Army program, not DoD entirely, but we'll get into that. Thanks for joining us today, guys. How you been? What's the hot gossip?
We've been good. We should probably say up front that the opinions expressed by me and Drew do not reflect on H2F in any kind of official capacity. We obviously, if people follow us, have relationships with that program, but we can only, while we're here, speak on behalf of Mops and Mo's, which is not
smart. Couple people, actually, most like business-minded people who come on the podcast do that. I always forget to do it. I've never myself like had any sort of disclaimer, and I should probably build that in. But yeah, so do you guys both have like six-pack abs, or do you just like are you just passionate about fitness yourself?
Okay, used to.
Drew, you don't have a six-pack right now?
I don't know, man. God, what a weird first question.
Drew used to be fit. Like when I got to know Drew.
Is that a good
when I was getting to know him, he was chasing this Power Man goal where he was trying to do like 1,000-pound powerlifting total and an Ironman in the same few-hour period.
Let me walk you guys through this. So this may have been COVID. I don't know. I came across Nick Bare, for folks that know. Nick Bare. I think the like YouTube video was 205-pound guy runs 5 minutes, something, whatever. I didn't know who Nick Bare was, but watched the video, and for some reason he was going through his sort of triathlon phase. I'd never done a triathlon before, but at that same time I had randomly just sort of gotten into swimming. So fast forward a little bit, I came up with this dumbass idea to do a full Ironman combined with a powerlifting thing. So like effectively 1 rep deadlift into the swim, into a squat, into the bike, into a bench, into the run. Like that was, and it was the symmetry of it was very seductive. And I was working with Pararescue at the time. So there were a couple of guys and we were like, oh, we should do this as like a fundraiser or whatever. It ended up taking about I don't even remember, 1 to 2 years of my, like, that's all I trained for like 2 years. Did a couple of the shorter distances, got all the way up to a half iron distance. I never did the full, but when I did the half iron, and if John Romanello is listening to this, he did it with me. I think I had rhabdo. I almost died, basically, is what happened.
Man, like, is that even like, did people get injured doing that? Or
well,
did you pick it up?
The problem was, like, on paper, it was like doable, but because last minute, like John jumped in, so now we had 2 people. So the lifting became, it effectively stretched from like possibly a 4 to 5 hour event into like a 8, 9, 10 hour event. And so by the time we got to the run, like I was cramped up so bad. So it was horrendous. I think that's why all of my blood work was off when I went to see the function. Like it messed me up for a long time. It was fun. I would do it again, but that is the same time I met Alex.
Fun. Did you guys, did you hear about that? I think it was like some former Navy SEALs led a college lacrosse team workout, and they all got rhabdo.
Yeah, you hear that a lot, actually. It's more common than you want it to be.
That was the hot topic for a while among human performance staffs everywhere, because that's the classic. Like that lacrosse team had a human performance staff, And because coaches love Navy SEALs, they told like the actual professionals to go sit in a corner and let this guy run a workout. And now like half your team can't play because they're in the hospital.
Whoops.
What were they doing? Do you know?
Honestly, I remember lots of us like talking and wondering. I don't know exactly what they did. In the amount of time they had and the fact that the people were already athletic and pretty conditioned, I have to imagine some degree of resistance was involved, like some sort of external object they had to carry or lift. Because it's pretty impressive to produce rhabdo in that many people that quickly.
Dude, they're SEALs, man. It was probably like log PT for way longer than it should have been or something.
So that happens when you're what exactly is rhabdo? Like what?
Rhabdomyolysis. So effectively, I mean, like the layman's version would be that your muscle tissue breaks down into your bloodstream.
Yeah, your body starts digesting your muscles.
It's from over exercising the muscles, right? Like too quickly.
That's one way you can get it. Exercise-induced rhabdo is what we hear about in the fitness space. You can also get it from like blunt force trauma. People get it from car crashes and things like that, where like muscle tissue is damaged physically, like kinetically. But
I remember back early days of CrossFit, Uncle Rhabdo was like one of the characters that you would see.
I remember that.
And I think why it was so, I mean, saying it's prolific in CrossFit is probably an overstatement, but you see it a lot exercise science wise with a lot of eccentric movements. So think like wall balls, a lot of like the high rep pull up type stuff. So that's where you're seeing folks with like, you know, their arms get blown up, they get rhabdo, they end up, not everybody ends up in the hospital, but it doesn't feel good.
I was always surprised, and we could probably, I mean, it's a rabbit hole, but like kind of surprised it doesn't happen more in the military, especially with like maybe kids showing up who aren't used to doing like a lot of push-ups over and over again sort of thing. And is it permanent if you get like a really bad case of it?
Bad enough rhabdo can cause some like decently permanent kidney damage and stuff. But that said, like, it's like the diagnostic criteria for rhabdo is a little tough because if you took the creatine kinase level of everybody crossing the finish line in a marathon, they'd probably all meet criteria for rhabdo. But it's like it ranges in severity. Like you can have a mild or severe case, and
I would think to your point, I think there's probably more than is reported.
Yeah, I've witnessed some bad rhabdo stuff in the military. I won't call out the battalion or anything, but when I was a lieutenant, one of the battalions at my installation did a leader challenge where they had everybody squad leader and above do Murph followed by a 12-mile ruck, and your score was your combined time. And each of those events separately is like a high volume event that you have to recover from. Combining the two, especially with a population that wasn't in that great shape, realistically, they filled up the hospital beds at the on-base hospital, so people had to go off base.
Damn.
I hear about that stuff like a lot, where it's like, all right, we're gonna do either like a 12-mile ruck and then an ACFT, or an ACFT and then a 12-mile ruck, and it's like, who is like making these decisions that you think that's a good idea for a variety of reasons? But it seems to happen quite a bit. And
this is actually a common talking point that I have in like MOPS and MOES types of settings, is that I think so. Like if you were properly trained, you could totally do that. Like an ACFT and a 12-mile ruck for some people is a manageable amount to do in a day, right? But the military is much more interested in being warriors than the process of becoming warriors. Because what it takes to be fit enough to do something like that is consistent training over a long period of time.
Right.
That's not sexy. What's sexy is, hey guys, next Wednesday, we're going to throw down regardless of how prepped we are. And if you were just mentally tougher, you would do it.
Right.
Hero wads.
Yeah. So like the process of getting there is boring and requires discipline and time. That just doing it and sending it to the moon is like the approved strategy.
So, I mean, all right. So let's get into H2F, because I wonder, is this the type of stuff that, you know, H2F can help commands and units like learn about? So give me kind of a high level description of what H2F is and the work that you all are what the program is doing with the Army.
Well, before H2F, Drew was involved in a predecessor program to H2F called POTIF, if he wants to introduce that.
Yeah. So I guess maybe a bit of my background. So I got involved right out of grad school. I went to grad school in Scotland and was kind of sort of involved in what they had over there. It was, you could call it embedded humor performance, but at a much, much smaller level. when I graduated, that was right after, I should say, the original POTIF that Admiral McRaven had created. That was right after it got cut down. And for folks that are familiar with like the way government money works, he had spent OCO money, which was deployment dollars, on this program because it made sense. Like we're prepping for deployment.
What is the program, Drew?
POTIF, Preservation of the Force and Family. Forgive me.
Which consists of?
What do you mean?
Just because people like he's using acronyms that people don't know.
Fair enough.
Preservation of the Force and Family, aka POTIF, was SOCOM's Human Performance Program.
SOCOM's Human Performance
What
Program.
does the family have to do with that? Like, why was that a part of it?
I think if you look at some of the stuff that McRaven put out at the time, his realization was that like in the SOF community, we were sending guys overseas over and over again, and the level of care they were getting was effectively what you would find at like a high school in terms of strength and conditioning, dietitians, all this sort of thing. And so his idea of POTIF came from professional sport, collegiate sport, treating. That was kind of the first time, and this is early 2000s. That was like the first time we started treating soldiers, specifically special operations guys, like athletes, this whole warrior athlete concept. So the family piece, I think, is just part of that conversation, because if stuff at home is screwed up, then inevitably stuff at work isn't. So you saw resources extended to the family in some case. And so preservation of the force and family is kind of the catch-all. So I was involved in that program with Air Force Special Operations right out of grad school. That's where the Power Man came from. And then, you know this better than I do, Alex, the exact date they started doing pilot programs for H2F, 2018?
I honestly don't remember the date offhand, but what Drew's talking about is human performance has gradually migrated from just special operations into the conventional force.
Yeah. So to answer your question directly, H2F, Holistic Health and Fitness, is the Army's version of POTIF at scale. So like, whereas when I started with the Air Force, I had 100-ish guys. Now it's 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 soldiers for an embedded team of anywhere from 20 to 40 folks. And that's strength coaches, dietitians, cognitive performance, physical therapy, athletic training. So to sort of put a bow on it for folks, it's what you would see at a D1 college sort of for the military. And it's this idea that if we train better for, say, the ACFT, for deployment, for whatever, if we fuel better, if we're cognitively more prepared, then we will be more, the word that they love is lethal. We'll be more lethal.
Is it primarily targeted towards your combat arms folks, or is it everybody?
This one I can answer pretty well.
Go for it.
So I'm still involved to some degree in like the planning of the whole thing. It was initially slated for 110 brigade elements across the active duty force. That certainly does bias combat arms in terms of infantry brigades, striker brigade, heavy brigades, but it is also for aviation brigades, sustainment brigades,
artillery.
Yep, our DIVARTIs get it, or our separate field artillery brigades, engineer brigades get it.
Medical.
Yeah, Drew, medical brigade.
I'm at a medical brigade, yeah.
But who that leaves behind most notably is anybody not organized into a traditional brigade, which is actually the majority of the active duty force is not in a traditional brigade. Mm-hmm. And it also leaves out the entirety of Compo 2 and 3, which I think we're going to talk about here, given that we're talking about the part-time military.
Yeah, so I guess you got into this a bit, Drew, but what is your like background? How are you a fitness expert guy?
I mean, to go way back, one of my best friends in high school decided he was going to start working out, and I didn't want him to beat me, so I started doing it too. And then that was when, like, for folks that remember, like SEAL Fit, Mark Divine, that sort of stuff, way back. So that's kind of what I was doing through college. And in college, I was actually studying business with this sort of idea of going to OCS for the Marine Corps. My recruitment sergeant got kicked out of the Marine Corps, which kind of derailed that. And I ended up that's how I ended up in Scotland for grad school. And then one of the guys that I was in my program in Edinburgh, which was strength and conditioning, another American, he had done some work for the military. And I didn't really know that human performance in the military was a career. It was very, very new. And literally just by luck, when I graduated from that program was when I got the offer to jump on board with the POTF contract. So a lot of the guys and gals in military human performance have come from collegiate, professional sport, whatever. For me, it was right out of school into tactical. So my whole career has been tactical. And like I said, it was first with the Air Force, and just by virtue of where I was at in Arizona, also doing some work with other government agencies, with the Border Patrol, with sort of that kind of scene going on out in the Wild West, and then coming over here to the East Coast. So I guess that's sort of the quick version of the background.
And then Alex, I know, so you were obviously you were regular Army. Now you're in the reserve. How did you kind of fall into being involved with H2F?
Yeah, the version of my journey, I was not somebody who like grew up knowing I wanted to be in fitness or strength conditioning or anything like that. I was not even a particularly fit person when I joined the Army. We've discussed this on our podcast before, but like I failed my first APFT when I arrived at the Army as a cadet. Since got my life together in a few different ways. But I commissioned as an intelligence officer. I did pretty normal intelligence officer stuff for most of my active duty time.
Went to West Point.
Shh, we don't talk about that.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, sorry. Don't hold it against me.
I don't know if it went up or down in my book.
Down. It went down.
So I did the intel thing. And then honestly, I was getting ready to leave the Army with no plans to serve in the reserve component, actually. I was at Fort Drum. The whole reason I had picked 1st Brigade 10th Mountain out of career course was because I wanted to deploy, and they were next on the patch chart. So I was driving from career course to Fort Drum. They told me, don't even bother getting a place to live. Just put your stuff in storage. We're going to deploy right away. And then like right as I'm arriving, they're like, hey, bad news. Deployment's canceled. First SFAB stood up. They're taking the deployment. There might be a chance for you to go to Africa. We'll see. We'll figure it out. So I end up I was at Fort Carson for my first assignment, loved Colorado. Now I find myself in a place I don't like as much, doing almost exactly the same job as I was doing before. And the deployment I thought I was going on vanished into thin air. So I started filling out paperwork to leave the Army, but that's when they started talking about this new cool ACFT thing. And a buddy called me and said he'd gotten orders to go be part of the ACFT implementation, but he couldn't do it because he had just taken command. So those orders were going to get canceled, and he thought I might be interested in it because at this point I'd like gradually gotten more and more into fitness over my career. People kind of knew that. So I told MI branch like, hey, it's either you give me this assignment to the physical fitness school or I quit. Not necessarily what I recommend for career management. They did not appreciate that. Burned a couple bridges that way.
Got to do what you got to do.
Yeah, so that resulted in a very, very short notice PCS to the Army Physical Fitness School. Ended up teaching master fitness trainer. Timing was good. This is also when they were starting to launch H2F. So when I did finally leave active duty, I transitioned pretty smoothly into a civilian job implementing holistic health and fitness.
You know, when I went to basic training or OSIT like a decade ago, looks like we might have lost Drew. They had these like
still here. There. Just can't see you guys.
All right, you'll just be the god in the clouds that we'll hear. They had these like people there, these teams, which seems almost like an H2F type thing that were supposed to be like monitoring our, I don't know, our physical fitness and helping us like stretch and not get injured. And my main takeaway from that was just how mean they were to everybody, because they were like some random like grad school students, but they adopted the drill sergeant like way of treating us. And it's just like, who the hell are you? You're just like some 22-year-old like nobody who's like yelling at me because you think you're anyway. That's just is that part of, or was that like a precursor? Do you know what I'm talking about?
My best guess on who those people were the embedded athletic trainers, because those have been in place longer than H2F in the initial entry training environment. And that's largely because of the ridiculously high injury rate in initial entry training.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so at the brigade level, it sounds like, you know, they have some number of H2F like resources that would be like maybe nutrition and like, you know, exercise performance type stuff. Like, but are the H2F folks, are they helping the leadership of the various, you know, units actually plan and implement their PT, or are they just kind of like we're here if you need us, or we'll come and do like a visit. But as we talked about, there's a lot of bad PT decisions that get made. And I wonder if you guys are able to help sway that off.
It's very brigade dependent.
Mm.
There is an official H2F doctrine, FM 722, but rarely do you follow that to the T. So you do see some organizations that are super bought into the idea, and the H2F team has a lot of say or control over what that stuff looks like. And then you have other organizations that are not super open to the idea, especially of civilians being involved in PT. One of the things, I mean, Alex and I talk about this all the time, but there's this interesting tension around, should PT be in the domain of the NCO as like a leadership development tool, or should PT be more in the domain of the subject matter expert as like a training tool? And some places straddle that line, I think, really well. And then other places it's like, hey, Sergeant so-and-so is in charge of PT, strength coach so-and-so, go sit in the corner and like occasionally talk to them about why you shouldn't do Murph followed by a 12-mile rock. But it's very brigade dependent, I would say.
Okay.
For better or for worse.
I mean, and there's larger, sort of cultural Army issues at play here if we're talking holistic health, right? I mean, it's the hours they're making people work, lack of sleep, stress levels, all of that, goes into whether people are able to perform and what they're capable of doing and if they're recovering. And do you guys ever, as H2F, wade into that territory where it's like, I know we're mostly here to like focus on probably primarily like, PT type stuff, but like, have you thought about not, treating your people in some of these ways?
I'll turn loose on this if you want. I'll probably get in trouble, but that's sort of the crux of the whole issue, right? Is that like the biggest, and again, this is something we talk about, like call it H2F, whichever embedded human performance acronym you want to use. Like you're running into, I think, very quickly a crossroads where it's like, does the culture of the military, whichever branch you choose, can it support this idea of the human being as sort of squishy as the human is? For example, like sleep, operational tempo, all these other competing requirements. In order for us to truly address the human at play here, you have to be open to the conversation of changing some of those things that for so long we just have refused to change. I mean, path dependency is one of the things that we talk about. So does the military have the appetite to do some of that? I don't know. That's kind of why we sort of started having the conversations we're having. You're seeing some of the things change. But again, the hill that we say we're always going to die on is a great example. Like fast food is prolific on military installations. And like, if you want to talk about low hanging fruit, no pun intended, an easy way to fix some of the musculoskeletal kind of body composition issues we see in the military is to address the availability of fast food. But it doesn't happen because, one, a lot of folks throw their hands up. Oh, hey, like the contracting mechanisms at play. Right. Too bad. We just can't do anything about it. It's like, well, you could. It'd be hard. So it's very easy to address PT tests and workout schedules and that sort of stuff. And I think that's where you're seeing a lot of progress because it's easily done. The harder long-term stuff is more of the institutional hurdles. And that is something that's going to take a lot of time.
To add a layer to that, I think most leaders, if you talk to them, understand that the other domains are just as, if not more important than the physical domain. Nutrition, sleep, mental health, all these things. I think the biggest problem is that the physical domain is the easiest to measure, and PowerPoint slides and OERs and NCOERs and all these things are driven by what can you quantify, what can you track on a chart. And it's a lot harder. Like there's ways to track some of those other domains, but that gets into privacy issues and how reliable questionnaires are and stuff. But spiritual is part of H2F. How do you track spiritual? Sleep is part of it. Are you going to put wearables on everybody to measure their sleep? Are you going to like get people in trouble if they don't get good enough sleep? Like it just gets a lot, like Drew said, squishier once you get outside the physical domain.
You just look at the results. Yeah, you might not be able to track everything at that micro level, but if you start implementing these things and then comparing it to your baseline, this is where we went after we started doing all of this. Like we can infer that it had positive, effects on the things that can be measurable, which are, performance. And I know you guys talk a lot about like the food issue on active duty Army bases, right? Which to me is, I mean, the fact that that's somehow still a problem is like, if you fix nothing else, just, have quality food and make it available. And then you don't even have to get rid of the fast food. If the food's decent enough and available, people don't feel like they have to go out and order, from Panda Express every day.
I have a policy proposal in my head lately, and I don't know if you've talked to Rob Evans, the guy who put together Hots and Cots. For those who aren't familiar, it's the Yelp of DFACs in barracks across the DoD, and it allows people to upload photos, and it allows him to like publicize it so it gets attention. Pretty cool platform for.
So you like still?
He's not. He's out. He's doing this totally on the side for no money, just because he cares. He was an E5, I think, before he got out. Awesome dude. But I probably need to call him up and chat about this proposal because he's in a good place to help advocate for it. But the simplest one I can come up with is just pass a law that says every dollar of BAS subtracted from soldiers' paychecks must be spent on food for soldiers. Because right now that's not the case. We take meal card holders' money out of their paycheck, and then we only put the amount of money in based on head count at the DFAC. And that ends up being like less than a quarter of the amount we took from soldiers. So it's, I don't know. That seems like an easy solution. Maybe I'm an idiot and don't understand all the policy wickets that has to get through. But
how much of that is like, specific to a particular duty station where like that commander, that CG has the ability to like really lock in their food program versus this is a blanket wide Army type problem?
I think it's some of both. One of my mentors was like trying to get involved in fixing it. And what he found was that he wasn't able to really influence it until he was a brigade commander, which tells you a lot about how hard it is. Like it takes a full bird to really do anything about it. So that's frustrating. I think division, especially the division food service advisor, who's a warrant officer, like they get a lot of influence on these kinds of things, but they still have to work within the bounds of policies, which are set by higher echelons and ultimately Congress. And I think some of these policies could use a little work.
Yeah, I mean, as you mentioned, it goes back to, the way money is changing hands and contracts and whatnot, which is probably a large part of it. Are any bases doing a particularly good job with their food stuff?
I've seen some stuff that's good. It tends to like come in. One of the biggest problems is that like it usually gets really good at a brigade, and then that brigade deploys and everything gets messed up, and they have to try and rebuild it when they get back, and they probably don't have the same people who made it good before they deployed. I know like the whole meal prep program, I believe started at Fort Drum, unless I'm wrong. They've had some really good results up there. Then it migrated to Fort Liberty. I've seen some really good versions of it there. So I've seen places that are doing really good stuff. I've seen like similar meal prep initiatives at JBLM, plenty of places.
Soft does well, obviously.
Yeah. Whichever, I always forget what brigade it was, but there's a brigade at Fort Moore, the one that teaches all like the armor and cav courses. That unit has a fantastic DFAC. I don't know what they're doing that's so different. I've seen lots of really good soft DFACs, but for a conventional DFAC, this one is killing. I saw like the number of civilians that were going there. I saw soft people coming over to go to the conventional DFAC. It was like they do surf and turf like once a week or something. And I went and got like steak, crab, like a huge pile of fresh berries. It's just like an incredible spread. I don't know what they were doing over there, but somebody should figure that out.
Pile of berries.
Yeah. I was thinking about this the other day. Have you ever heard like the expression that like when you eat Chinese food, even if you eat a lot of it, like you're kind of hungry, like not that much longer after you eat it. So
now we're talking about satiety. Yeah.
Well, and I feel like DFAC food, even if it's like good food, steak and whatever, you go in there and you eat it and it's like, I don't know. It's like, I don't know how to describe it, but it's like fake food. Yeah. Like you can eat a lot of it and then you're hungry an hour later. It's like, I just ate this food and like, what's going on here?
I do wonder about that. We've talked about some of the nutrition stuff plenty, but there are a lot of factors at play that drive satiety. Some of the primary factors are the macronutrient breakdown of what you ate, how much fiber was in it, things like that. If you're choosing more processed options, you're going to experience less satiety per calorie consumed. Like that's just the nature of processing food, is it reduces fiber. But also the way you think about it does affect it. So if you have like a bad idea in your head of DFAC food, that can like directly affect how your hormones respond to eating it. It's interesting stuff.
I think even having just, instead of these large DFACs that they might have like 2 or 3, on a base somewhere, oftentimes, especially if you're junior enlisted, you might be far away. You might not have a car. They usually have terrible hours. Consider making smaller micro things that are all over the place, serving better food.
Once upon a time, every battalion had their own DFAC.
Yeah. I mean, to me, that sounds like a pretty good idea. And then what are your thoughts on like, because the Army used to have like, cooks actually cook all the food and handle, from soup to nuts, the stuff. And then I guess it moved to contractors at some point. Do you think that would be a helpful thing to do?
So one, I'm not an expert on this. And two, there are layers. So one, the Army certainly still has cooks running DFACs in many places, but the Army also has very publicly made a decision that the primary role of cooks is field feeding and deployment feeding. And they need to prepare for those things and focus on those things. And it's harder to keep DFACs open if that's your priority. So there are more and more contracted out DFACs. I have eaten in both traditional soldier operated DFACs that were good and contracted DFACs that were good. I think you can do either version well. It's just about how you staff it and how you resource it. I think I do my annual training now as a reservist at Fort Eustis, and that DFAC that I eat at is all contractors, and it's fantastic. So you can certainly do that model well. The Army's they just put out the request for proposal like 1 or 2 days ago for the the Future Army Fueling Initiative. I don't even remember what it's called anymore. But that's supposed to be campus style dining, and it will be like fully taken over by contractors to do a bunch of different things, supposedly including delivery and stuff. I'm not totally sure that's the answer yet. I remain skeptical, but I think any version of it can be done well. I think people like to blame the model they're executing as the problem, when I've seen every model done well and I've seen every model done poorly, and it has a lot more to do with local leadership. I don't know.
I'm going to ask one more question, then I want to move on to mops and mows, or is it mopes and mows? I don't know how to pronounce
Mops and mows.
I like mopes.
Mopping the floor, mowing the lawn.
Well, I might have just forgotten my question, so we might have to move on to mops and mows. It'll come back to me. Damn it, that was a good question too. All right, so talk to me about mops and mows. Obviously, you guys, you're doing H2F. What is mops and mows, and why are you doing it?
I'll do a few different versions of like the stump speech thing here, because mops and mows first started being a thing as just a social media page, an Instagram page, and the reason I created that was because we were implementing the ACFT. A lot of the force had big feelings about the ACFT, didn't know how to train for it. This thing's crazy. What do we do? And I was getting frustrated because I worked at the fitness school at the time. And it was not that the Army didn't have the information to give people for how to train. It was just that the Army sucked at communicating across its own force. So I was trying to leverage official platforms, namely the physical fitness school's social media platform, to put some of that information out. But because of all the politics around the ACFT, there were all these media blackouts and all these rules about what we could post and all these layers of screening it had to go through. So there were too many hurdles to do it through official channels. So I said, hey, screw it. Clearly people want this information. I'm just going to create a page and go do that. And I got lucky on a few occasions. Like Sergeant Major Grinston's team thought it was helpful, so they shared it a couple times. A couple of people caught on to it. The ACFT was what everyone was talking about, so they all came looking for it. The reason it evolved into the podcast and I brought Drew on board and things like that is because social media is not a great place to communicate nuanced, complicated things or have real conversations about real issues. Social media is a great place for like hot takes and memes, and that only gets you so far. So knew we needed a place for some of these longer form, more in-depth things. Bumped into Drew as a part of actually running an LPD series for the physical fitness school. He was invited on to talk about data, and we started having conversations. Drew was the first person, or at least like the rudest person, to tell me that like just because I'd gotten my CSCS, I was not an expert, and actually I was full of shit and needed to learn a bunch of stuff.
I don't think I said it like that. Maybe I did.
I'm pretty sure it's close to that. Yeah.
I
so
remember my question,
that's the short version of how we got here.
My question was, it was about data. Do you have any data around how much it costs the Army to feed like a soldier, I guess, either monthly or yearly?
I know, give me a second. So I'll try and get you like a real number, because I did look that stuff up not that long ago. Because there's really two numbers that are relevant to that. One is BAS. Everybody's familiar with that. That's how much money soldiers are given to feed themselves. But it's even said that number is not supposed to cover all of sustenance. But then the number the Army uses is BDFA, Basic Daily Food Allowance. That's what they budget to feed a soldier.
And that's just literally the food versus the infrastructure of DFAC contractors. So that's what I'm getting at. Now, if you figure out that, and then you can say, okay, it costs.
I don't know that number.
It costs $1,500 a month or something to feed a single soldier. And then you say, let's do away with all this. Let's set up healthy food stores and give each soldier $1,500 a month just to use to buy the food there. Then, that's another solution. I'm literally solving the whole problem on this podcast. To speak.
No, you're 100% correct.
The problem is education, though. I mean, you hand soldiers an extra $1,500, you would hope that they would.
Yeah, that would be the problem. Then it's week 2 of the month, and they don't have any money to buy food, and then it's somebody else's problem. So,
correct.
Inevitably, that would happen. Okay, so Mops and Mo's Instagram page. You do have some good content there, and I think you're right. It's a good place to maybe put out information and start conversations, but not necessarily engage in, as you said, longer form, sort of nuanced discussions. So are you running, would you call it kind of a guerrilla warfare campaign around some of these things to sort of...
That sounds really sexy. I
used to call it an insurgency. I used to refer to Leg Tuck Nation as an insurgency.
We're going to get into that.
Oh, yeah.
Flag.
I was pretty directly asked to stop using the word insurgency, because the United States Department of Defense does not love when members of that organization are referring to what they're doing as insurgency.
A lot of precedent.
So I don't use that term specifically anymore.
Now we're a terrorist organization.
Yeah, we're just fully out there. Yeah. No, but there's. Yeah. I talked to Drew about this a lot. What the heck are we doing here? And I would say one of the core things that we are doing is taking conversations that normally happen behind closed doors and bringing them out into the open so people can hear the real conversations happening. Because I know the way I operate is not necessarily something that all of my employers totally love. I have my civilian day job, and then I have my Army Reserve job, and then I have my side hustle Mops and Mo's thing. And other people, smarter people than me, would keep those things totally separate from each other where they're unrelated. Problem is all of my jobs are human performance. In my civilian, military, and side hustle capacity, I basically talk about the same stuff. So it's really hard to separate.
We call that synergy.
I'll put it more bluntly. I think a lot of human performance organizations in the military are self-licking ice cream cones. You get this sort of positive feedback loop where, because the data is so fuzzy and the leadership changes over so frequently,
right,
very rarely are you truly held accountable to the impact that you're having. And so you see a lot of things with I mean, I don't want to name names, but conferences, symposiums, whatever, under this banner of human performance, where you're just sort of repeating the same thing. But are we truly having an impact? That, I think, was the genesis for a lot of the conversations we decided to start having, was what if, instead of maybe quote unquote pretending like everything is perfect in this space, what if we actually go after some of the harder questions And I think over the years, we've gotten a little bit bolder with some of that. I mean, we mentioned kind of the conversations around Make America Healthy Again and some of the conversations we've had about like DFACs and that sort of stuff. So some of it is kind of intentionally cynical because we do want to ask some of those hard questions and we do want to bring people into the conversation who are actually sitting at a level where they can make a decision. Like one of the conversations we had not too long ago was with a contracting company. And it's like, hey, pretty much everybody on these contracts is complaining about the same thing. Why can't you do anything? Like, why aren't you doing anything about it? And we got some really good conversation out of that. And to their defense, like there were some things they couldn't do. There maybe are some things they could do. But for lack of having a podcast, I don't know where else you would have that conversation unless it's behind closed doors, and then nobody benefits. So,
I met someone at the Pentagon recently who's running a program. They just started it called the Army Center for Army Council of Junior Officers or something like that. It's something like that.
Army Junior Officer Council. Yeah.
AJAC or whatever.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about.
Because I know that's kind of what they're doing for a broad range of, basically bringing junior officers to the table to tell leadership sort of about issues, I believe. Have you guys plugged into that at all?
I am certainly aware of AJAC. We have not like formally done anything together yet. That's certainly on the table. I do think one of the toughest parts to navigate is what you can do in an official capacity and what you can do in an unofficial capacity. So once I say that line that people heard at the very beginning of this conversation of like, I'm only speaking on behalf of myself / Mops and Moes, I'm not speaking on behalf of the DoD or the military or anywhere I work. I get to start doing a lot more things, but not in an official capacity. That's why I get to be more blunt on Mops and Moes. My style is not quite as polished and professional as an official page would have to be. I've actually gotten in like fights about this in the past. If you're out there, and I'll say this to AJAC as well, if you're out there running a social media platform that even looks like it's official on behalf of the DoD, I would get really smart on the DoD social media policy. I would make sure you have attended the required external official presence training. I would make sure like PAO knows what you're doing because there are layers to it. And there's a reason I run my page unofficially. It does make it a little bit hard for me to partner with official outlets. I have done a little bit with like big Army public affairs, like Department of the Army public affairs. Around the Army's birthday, I was like trying to get people to post leg tucks on social media, and like the big Army page supported it, which was really funny.
Huh. By the way, like, are you guys DA civilians with H2F or?
Drew is a DA civilian. Okay. I am a Department of the Air Force civilian working for the Space Force.
Okay.
He's a stormtrooper.
Okay.
I commute to the moon.
Mm-hmm.
Did Mops and Moes, and by the way, I think you'd be hard pressed to find someone who can, without looking it up, tell you the difference between a mop and a mow.
Yeah.
And I've gotten into so many arguments about this in Army spaces where people think they know what it is and they've got them reversed or they're wrong.
Oh, yeah.
But for the audience, it's a measure of performance and a measure of effectiveness. Mm-hmm. Do you want to briefly explain what that means?
Yeah, I will break it down for you. Before I do, and before I get in trouble, was the guy you met with AJAC, Chris Swininger?
Yes.
Okay, I just want to shout out Chris so he gets his name out Chris. There. If you are interested in being a part of the stuff he's doing with Army Junior Officer Council, track down Chris Swininger. To answer your question, though, what the heck are Mops and Moes? And I'll do this two ways. I will do like the audience interaction version, and then I'll do the stump speech version. So I will ask you a question first, because this is the fitness version of Mops and Moes. How do you know if a workout was good? You went to the gym, you were working out, you were doing fitness. What is it you look for to know whether that was a good workout?
That's an actual question or a rhetorical?
Yeah, that's a question for you.
I mean, I'm looking at those, heart rate. Am I sweating? But really, I need to measure it over time.
Ooh, good answer. So I asked that question to a wide range of audiences of all different ranks and backgrounds and stuff. And the typical answers I get are sore, tired, and sweaty, right? That's the Army PT answer. As long as we got those soldiers sore, tired, and sweaty, success. And to borrow from a mentor of mine, Mark Taysom, who's been in the human performance space much longer than I have, if those are the metrics for a good workout, then I will give you the best, fastest workout of your life. Meet me in a sauna at 2 a.m. and I'll punch you in the face, right?
Alex loves this story.
You'll be sore because you got punched in the face. You'll be tired because it's the middle of the night, and you'll be sweaty because you're in a sauna. Those are symptoms of exercise, and one could argue that they are even measures of performance, right? Did we do the thing right? Did we work like we knew what we were going to do? Did we do it with enough intensity and duration to get sore, tired, and sweaty? That's measures of performance. Because measures of performance are measuring, regardless of the task you are doing, how well did you do it? Did you meet the standard for that task? But measures of effectiveness are measuring whether you got closer to the desired end state. Because it's possible to execute a task perfectly, but have chosen the wrong task to execute in the first place and not have achieved the goal you wanted. The military understands. So, like, I did not make up MOPS and MOS, right? It originally came from systems engineering. The military is probably the biggest user of the framework. Nerds who care about doctrine can find it in Joint Publication 3.0. And if you go to ILE and want to be a field grade, you can learn all about it. But a more typical military example would be like Vietnam or Iraq or Afghanistan. It's really hard to measure progress towards more stable governance. So instead, we just do the tasks and measure whether we're doing them. So a classic measure that we used in all three of those conflicts, we ended up realizing it was dumb and shifted gears. But for a long time in all three of those theaters, we looked at number of bad guys in body bags. That measures whether you're doing a lot of combat, right? And that measures whether you're killing a lot of bad guys. Measure of performance, cool. But it doesn't measure whether you're getting closer to the goal. And to bring it full circle with the sauna thing, the only way you know if a workout was good is if you are making progress towards your goal, which means you had to have defined the goal in the first place and chosen ways to measure progress. So yes, MOPS and MOS is like way bigger than fitness, but we use it in a fitness context.
So the Mo is, are you doing the right things?
Correct. Are you doing things right is MOP. Are you doing the right things is Mo. We
still get asked who's MOP and who's Mo.
And for the record, Drew is MOP and I am Mo.
I think it's the other way around.
Nope, you're wrong.
Did MOPS and MOS really kind of come on the scene because of all the new ACFT and then all the leg tuck stuff that came out of it? I don't even know where the hell we're at with it now. Are we sticking with the ACFT as it stands? Is it changing again? Like, what is going on? Where am I? I want answers.
So, yes, MOPS and MOS emerged pretty directly because of the ACFT.
We definitely rode the wave.
Yeah, it rode the wave of ACFT interest in fitness. Yes, it also featured a lot of leg tuck kind of stuff, which has been surprisingly divisive depending on who you talk to.
Well, explain the symbolism of the leg tuck, like why it,
I mean, those who don't know, the leg tuck was part of the original version of the ACFT, and the Army decided it was too hard. We briefly went to a phase where you could choose between the leg tuck and the plank, and then we fully gave up and just went with the plank.
I mean, this could be the basis for an entire episode, which I'm sure you guys have done before. But if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the issue, right, was that too many people, I think mostly female, maybe males too, were unable to do the leg tuck to standard. Right?
Correct. It was more women than men, but that was not there were definitely lots of men failing it as well. And part of the problem is the people who were failing it were concentrated in like low density critical MOSs like medical and lawyers and things like that. So that was uniquely problematic.
Well, and you talk about this a lot because I think the standard at the time, which I preferred, it was way easier than doing a plank for like 2 minutes or 3 minutes, was a single leg tuck, right? To pass it. I don't remember what the max was. But I still find it hard to believe that so many people couldn't do a single leg tuck.
I think a few things are factors. One is, and we should admit this because it's relevant, leg tucks are, proportionally speaking, harder for people with a lower center of mass, which tends to be women. because of the like arc of the movement and the lever arms involved. It makes it a little harder for them. Put gender and sex aside for a second. They're also very hard for fat people. We'll just say that straight out. Like if you're carrying a lot of weight around your midsection, that's going to make a leg tuck a lot harder. And then
isn't that the idea though? Like
that is, yes, it's the idea. Correct.
well, we don't think you're fat. Maybe like we don't want you in the military, or you need to get to the point where you can.
But
do a
like,
leg
just to
tuck
be
'cause you're
clear,
not
like, I
fat.
now work for the Air Force, right? And the Air Force has not had a body composition policy in place for a while now, and part of the reason I think is because they are scared of the consequences of enforcing a body composition policy after not doing it for a few years. So yes, we want people to be fit, but we also want enough people, right? There's a balance there to be found. But that brings us to one of the core ones that I don't want to skip over, and that is that getting your first leg tuck is slightly complicated, right? If you can't do enough push-ups, you just do push-ups. If you can't do enough sit-ups, you just do sit-ups. If you suck at running, you just do more running. And in all three cases, you'll generally get better. Yes, certain strength and conditioning programs might help you more than random stuff, but the secret is that everything works. So if you just do sit-ups, you'll get better at sit-ups. If you just do push-ups, you get better at push-ups. But to go from 0 leg tucks to 1 leg tuck has this tiny extra layer of creativity or critical thinking required. And I remember like showing drill sergeants that you could like walk your legs up the side of the pull-up bar into the top position and then do a negative if you couldn't do 1 leg tuck, and it blew their minds. And like, I do think the Army would have been capable of teaching that to the force, but the Army was so scared of the potential administrative disaster of having a bunch of people fail the fitness test that they weren't willing to go through the, I would argue, pretty simple process of showing people how to train for it.
Well, it was still kind of a disaster, right? Because they rolled out this program, I would think, based on years of research, and then it's like, oh, this doesn't work. Too many people are going to fail it. Now we have to change the whole thing, even though we just rolled out this program. And yeah, like you said, then it was like you can do either. Now the leg tuck's completely gone. So I wouldn't say that went particularly like well. And then I had also heard that like, is it possible we're going to go back to the ACFT, or is that not?
So let's address this directly. So I think what you meant is go back to the APFT, right?
Sorry, APFT.
Yeah. So that rumor comes around constantly. I pay a lot of attention to both what's going on at Army senior leader levels and what's going on in versions of congressional bills and things like that. Like I do keep an eye on this. I don't think there is any likelihood of going back to the APFT. I don't see that happening. It was briefly in the Senate's version of the NDAA like a year ago almost now. Tom Cotton proposed it because he was pissed that the run standards were so easy. It honestly got removed like within a couple weeks after that. Like it wasn't taken seriously by basically anyone. But what I can tell you is very likely coming is higher standards for combat MOSs on the ACFT. Congress had RAND do a report on ways to do that. RAND has published that report. It's out there. Anybody can read it. And the Army tends to just do whatever RAND reports tell them to do. So we will probably see that implemented.
I thought we already had that like by branch breakdown. There were different standards.
No, that's in the original ACFT. There were different standards based on your MOS.
Right.
That was the thing. Back when the ACFT was age and gender neutral, it was MOS based, gold, gray, black. Black being combat jobs had the highest standards. That went away like a couple years ago now. We are on to no adjustment for MOS, but we do have different age and gender standards, which is a little bit ironic because the ACFT indirectly came about from 2012 guidance to open combat jobs to women. And the Secretary of Defense's statement at the time was that we like weren't going to adjust standards. Like we would let everybody in who could meet those standards. And that was the whole point of creating a gender neutral test.
Right.
That has all gone out the window. It doesn't exist now.
Yeah.
So we're kind of coming full circle to some degree.
Do you think is the ACFT a better measure of fitness than the APFT? And B, is it a good test? And if you could design like your ideal 3 to 5 event PT test, what would that be?
we've done this one.
Yeah, don't get Drew started. We have like multiple entire podcast episodes on that topic.
Depends on what day of the week it is.
Yeah.
I think it's a good test. I was initially, as somebody who kind of deals with this on a daily basis, initially skeptical only because of all the kind of congressional bullshit that was tied into it. I mean, you very quickly legislate yourself away from like good, honest sports science towards what makes the most sense for my constituents. And that's kind of
Right.
whatever. So I think it's a better test than the APFT, if for no other reason than by including things like a deadlift, like a sprint rack carry, you automatically force soldiers to train differently. And you see that on a daily basis. I mean, instead of just going out and doing a run or push-ups or sit-ups, like you do have to spend some time around a barbell doing things. And that's just a better way, I think, of being a human. So from a behavioral change standpoint, I think it's fantastic. Is it the best test ever? No. I think the issue that we're up against was the same thing we experienced when I was with SOF, which was that you can't quantify combat the same way you can quantify a football game or a basketball game. And so in those sports, you do see testing that makes a lot more sense, like translated to a game or a performance setting. With combat, you don't have that luxury. And so it's sort of anybody's guess. You know, we've never lost to the enemy because they out deadlifted us. But that's a very sexy and seductive conversation to have for people who spend time in laboratories and like to set up fake combat events. And then, you know, let's create an event that looks like that. And next thing you know, like we've mimicked combat in it. So I don't know if we ever get to that standard. I think you could probably simplify the ACFT. And that's what Alex and I have talked about. Like, what's sort of the bare minimum? Could you do just pull-ups and a deadlift or, you know, whatever? That's probably the direction I would go in. But if, you know, APFT or ACFT, I think ACFT is probably the better move.
What are your thoughts, Alex?
I'd say roughly the same thing. There is no such thing as a perfect test. It will not exist. Certainly not for force wide. And I think the political ringer that the ACFT went through did some degree of damage to it. I don't think it is quite what it could have been, but it is certainly an improvement over the APFT. And as much as we like to say, don't train for the test, train for the mission, inevitably a large portion of people are just going to train for the test. And the incentives created by the ACFT, if you're going to train for the test, are going to push people towards much more relevant and well-rounded fitness.
See, I don't know. I think it's easier to come off the street and pass the ACFT than the APFT. I speak from experience.
So let's talk about MOPS versus MOS. Is how easy it is to pass off the street the goal of the test, or is whether the test measures something actually useful important?
What I'm basing it off is when I have not been as rigid in my physical training for a long time, my base level of physical fitness is not good. And given that status, if I had to pass a test at that lower level of fitness, I would choose the ACFT over the APFT.
I think passing the ACFT is easier than passing the APFT for most ages and genders. I think that is a true statement.
That's a product of the standards versus the movement.
That's correct.
That is true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think the ACFT standards are too low right now. I think Drew and I can agree on that.
Sure, agree.
But that's a function of it getting savagely torn apart by the political process. The original standards were pretty respectable. The original goal was like nobody would max it. Like if you have people routinely maxing out a test, it's a bad test. Like it's not good at measuring what you're trying to measure.
We want to see floating Z scores, but that's
what I will also point out too, though, is that, and people are sometimes surprised to learn this. As far as I know, looking at historical Army run standards, the APFT era was the fastest running standards I've found for the Army. And when you say it's harder to pass an APFT than it is to pass an ACFT, it's almost always the run people fail. It's not usually push-ups or sit-ups.
Right.
Even under the new ACFT scores, it tends to be the run that people fail, which is shocking and depressing because the standard is so easy. But I think Drew and I would agree that if we were going to adjust standards on the ACFT, one of the first things to adjust would be to require slightly faster run times.
Well, I also wonder too, sometimes you have to push people to improve. So if tomorrow the Army said, okay, the max is now the minimum to pass, people would be forced to train harder and like they would just get better naturally. Now everyone wouldn't meet that standard ever, or some people not, ever or immediately, but that would force people to actually go out there and train and make sure they could do the work. And they'd be able to do it versus just showing up and going for the minimum.
And yet, if you read all of the RAND studies ever published on the ACFT, which is where policymakers get their guidance, is these RAND reports, it is all about how many people would pass immediately with no adjustment to training. So even though the original idea of the whole change was that we aren't fit enough, we need to train to this higher standard, we then act surprised when people struggle with the higher standard and we immediately lower it rather than getting them to pursue it, which is the whole idea behind Leg Tuck Nation. People, it's not, I don't think the leg tuck is like a special exercise. I don't care about it that much. I care about it as a symbol of the Army one time briefly setting a higher standard and telling people to chase it and then giving up. That's where my frustration comes from, is that we could have achieved that. We had the opportunity to tell people we expect more of you and you have to try a little bit. And we just, because of the political system, couldn't hang on to it.
We're not mad. We're just disappointed.
Right. I love that.
Yeah.
You know, we flew too close to the sun and we burned our wings, but we'll always have that moment in time where we almost achieved greatness as an Army.
That's it.
Okay. So let's shift a little bit about, fitness and H2F as it relates to Compos 2 and 3, the National Guard and the Reserve. And I'm going to plug H2F. They came out, they sent a team into my unit's drill a few months ago. And, I was we don't usually do like organized PT. And, I was told to get downstairs and report this formation. And that's what it was. It was like them running us through some stuff. And I was not happy at the time. I had other stuff to do, but I was like, all right, whatever. But the whole battalion was out there up to the BC, and I found it really, really useful. And it was actually, it was a good time and it was useful information. But, I think the challenge is, we're not under the Army's control most of the time. And it's kind of up to the individual soldier to ideally keep fit. And even to be able to train some of these exercises if they don't have the equipment or access to a gym, and to know what they're doing and to eat right. And so obviously H2F is doing some things with the Guard and Reserve. I've seen that personally, but how can we do more? Like, what are you seeing? What's the art of the possible, to use a phrase that I have?
Alex's domain.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on that question.
He's living it.
First, let's talk resources. I mentioned earlier that H2F was originally planned to roll out across 110 active duty brigades with no plan for any other part of the military, to include Compos 2 and 3. Members of Compo 2 and 3 have done some grassroots efforts to get ahead of that a little bit. I think the Guard is a little bit ahead of the Reserve, but it's specific states that have decided to care about it. But that's started to improve. Resources have started to spread out. Funds are available, positions are available, things like that. So it's starting to get better. I will also say this past year at AUSA, General Mingus, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, made it explicitly clear that his intent and the Army's intent is to make sure some kind of H2F resources are available to everyone in the Army, no matter where you are. The Army is a big, complicated organization. So that means like recruiting stations, that means ROTC programs, that means reserve units, that means embassies, that means arsenals and depots. And it's going to have to look different at different places. I don't think copy pasting the kind of team that Drew leads for an active duty brigade and slapping it onto a National Guard state is going to work quite as people think it might, largely because of your point about people are only there 2 days a month, roughly. And to be clear, there is no exercise program that you can do 2 days a month and see any kind of results if people don't do things the rest of the month. There's just nothing. But the other side of it is, I, as a reserve soldier, have the opportunity to be much more physically fit than I did when I was active duty. I have the freedom to individualize for myself. I can use my time more efficiently. I don't have to train every morning at 6:30 for an hour and a half. I can actually accomplish the same amount with less time if I'm smart about it. But it's the art of how do you change people's behavior when they're not actually there. And that is extremely hard. People talk about like doctors don't care about lifestyle, they just care about pills. That's not true. Every doctor knows that lifestyle would have a huge positive impact. They are just also jaded because they've tried so many times to get people to change their lifestyle and failed. So it's a complicated puzzle to get people to care. And just to wrap up this rant and let it continue into a conversation, I will also say that you actually shouldn't just train the ACFT exercises as your program. There are very few things about fitness in policy for the Army. It's almost all doctrine. So it's a you should instead of you will. But one of the things that is in policy, this is AR 350-1 Appendix E. Yes, I'm that nerdy. But it says physical fitness tests will not form the foundation of unit or individual physical training programs. So there's a policy that says you're not going to train just based on the ACFT. What I would suggest people do is train the components of fitness and movement patterns associated with the ACFT rather than specific exercises. So if you tell me I can't train for the deadlift because I have no hex bars at my gym or at home, my answer is going to be, you're an idiot. Train lower body strength, train barbell deadlifts, train squats, train lunges. You'll perform fine. Like when the ACFT first came out, lots of people immediately maxed the test, even on the original standards, which were much harder. Those people didn't achieve those scores because they had advanced notice of the ACFT and practiced a lot of hex bar deadlifts and sprint drag carries. They were just generically really fit people. So if you just become a generically more fit person, that will show up on the test, even if you're not doing the sprint drag carry in your backyard. You get what I'm saying?
So somebody like me, fairly busy, but ideally try to maintain some semblance of physical fitness. I mean, I can go do my Monday, Wednesday, Friday kind of split, legs this day and then chest and whatever the other day. What are how do you suggest reservists tackle this? Is there an ideal plan or any resources that you suggest we use?
So a few potential answers, and I'll throw it over to Drew because Drew's a more accomplished strength and conditioning coach than I am. One, we should probably make more stuff available as free downloads on mopsandmos.com. We do have some stuff over there. One of the downloads is a checklist for what you should include in your physical training plan. It includes aerobic, anaerobic. It includes hinging and squatting and lunging and pressing. It helps you check all those boxes regardless of how many days a week you're going to train or what equipment you're going to use. So that resource is there. There are certainly things you can find in terms of like pre-built programs to follow, but the question you ask raises a question I think Drew and I could probably answer to a decent degree in like a quick free PDF that's just like, assuming you have little to no equipment and you're only going to train 3 days a week, what should you do? And that's something we probably owe to the community is like a bare bones version. And then if you want like more in-depth stuff, you might have to pay us because this stuff does take time. But that's a pretty good one to just kind of throw out there as like and I'm sure you can, if you just Google like how to train for the ACFT, I'm sure you can find tons of versions of that already out there.
What's like the ideal workout duration? So I feel like if I had infinite time, I would do like pre-workout stretching for like half an hour or 45 minutes. Then I'd go into my things. I'd do like probably build some cardio, some weightlifting, but like who has the time to do that? What I need is like something to get it down to 45 minutes that I can follow. All right, this day I'm doing these things for 45 minutes or half an hour. This day I'm doing this and I'm hitting everything and it's working. It's effective. That's what I need.
He's accidentally backing himself into describing CrossFit.
Well, I think I'll kind of jump in as I guess the strength coach here, but to answer your first question, the sexy marketing phrase getting thrown around a lot now is hybrid training, and that is where I would probably point most of the tactical population, if for no other reason than you are starting to see some really educated conversations around how to best combine running and lifting weights, and that's pretty much what the ACFT is. It's pretty much what combat is, if I could be that bold. Hybrid training. So what's interesting to me is like most of the athletes that I see come to work with me, or most of the groups that I work with are kind of doing what it sounds like you were kind of throwing up, which is, Monday legs, Wednesday arms. Like it comes from this bodybuilding tradition, in some cases maybe powerlifting tradition as well, if you're doing bench and squat and deadlift. And those are fine. But I think what happens is people do that for so long that they think a good training program has to have sets of 15 or 3 sets of this or 4. Like it's this very stereotypical setup, which then you get these other issues of it takes a long time. I don't have enough time to do that. I also have to do cardio, yada, yada, yada. So I say all that to say the first thing that we ask people to do is look at what you're actually doing and how much of it is actually doing something. Like when you do your 3 sets of 12 dumbbell bench press and 12 whatever, like are you literally doing that to the intent of what you should be doing, or are you just sort of fucking around for 12 reps and then you put the weight back and like,
Well,
so the
even
first
that's
thing
hard to figure out. It's like I don't know.
sure,
Like, am I lifting too much or not enough, or doing too many reps or not enough?
9 times out of 10, and maybe that's a stretch, but I'll say it, 9 times out of 10, people are doing too much. They're doing more than they need to. If you do like, so kind of come at it from the other way. What's the least amount of work I need to do? And that's really what training is. Like, what is the least amount that I need to do in order to accomplish the thing? Well, what's the thing? If it's the ACFT, it's hex bar deadlifts, which like Alex mentioned is just sort of a heavy hinge. It's a 2-mile run, which is sort of like a middle distance cardio event for most people. And you can structure a plan around that. We've talked about this on our platform, but you know, are we looking at intensity, i.e. heavy weights? Are we looking at volume, i.e. longer duration stuff? And I realize this gets a little bit into the weeds and you can get into how to structure all of that, but most folks are doing more than they need to. And the more stuff they're doing, the less effective it becomes. So you can have a really effective training plan that takes you 30 to 45 minutes a day. It's just not going to look like what you're doing now.
So a core piece of feedback I have received recently is that sometimes our content goes over people's heads.
Yeah, we're bad at that.
And so I think I'm going to take everything Drew said and say, yeah, that's all true. But I think we overestimate how much the average soldier or person wants to know to like nerd out about fitness and how much they just want to plan and go do it. So I'll point towards, and like shameless plug, we have a blog on mopsandmos.com. Go check it out.
We need to put more on there.
We do, but conveniently, the most recent post on the blog is Maximizing Fitness Efficiency. It's an article about minimum effective dose training. And the article ends with a program template that is 2 days per week, 45 minutes or less per session, that if soldiers did just that, like it's 2 different sessions, you just alternate between them. You do them once each per week. It shouldn't take you more than 45 minutes. Like you would do well on the ACFT just following that.
That was a guest post. Shout out Mark.
Well, yeah, Mark Christiani.
That's kind of the whole question, I guess, which gets back to how you set up a test that effectively measures like fitness. It's like, well, what is fitness? I need someone to say fitness means you can do these things in this amount of time or this amount of weight. If somebody can set that, that goalpost for me and say either if you can do this, you're fit and what you're doing is working, or if you can't, here's how you work up to that. And I don't know if I've ever seen like something that says if this is fitness, and maybe that's the bare minimum for the ACFT. I would argue it's not. But that's kind of the whole crux of the issue, I think. It's like, well, what is fitness? What does it mean to be fit? And I guess your goals too, as we talked about.
Yeah, we're already like 15 minutes over on how long the podcast was scheduled for, so I don't want to crack open a giant conversation, but that's a relevant topic, right? But the problem is there is no definition of like, are the competitors at World's Strongest Man fit?
Maybe.
For what they do, absolutely. They're the strongest people in the world. But if you ask them to run a 2-mile, they'd probably die. At the other end of the spectrum, is Eliud Kipchoge fit? Like the dude can run a marathon faster than most people can sprint. Like that's pretty impressive. But if you asked him to compete in World's Strongest Man, he might also die, like just literally break in half. And so fitness is dependent on the task, and the task of the military is combat, and combat is hard to define.
It's like that old, we've said this on our podcast before, the pornography in the Supreme Court conversation. I know it when I see it. I mean, that's basically, I mean, fitness is tough. I would argue the one you hear most often is like a decathlete is probably your ideal sort of specimen, but that's where you do get into these kind of sexy metrics that you'll see on CrossFit or whatever, where it's like double body weight deadlift and 7-minute 2K row. I mean, you do end up with this vacuum that can quickly be filled by arbitrary metrics, which is what then people use to define fitness. But
I hate CrossFit, for the record, but most people I know who have done it and stuck with it do end up getting really shredded or injured. But
or both.
yeah, I do want to end with one final question or topic that just occurred to me, because I haven't seen much discussion about it from the Army or the military. But all right, so these drugs, weight loss drugs, like
oh man,
whatever they are, what are your thoughts on this? And should the military start covering or implementing these to help people lose weight and get more fit?
You want me to go? You want to go?
You go first. You go first, then I'll go.
I am very cynical when it comes to pharmaceutical interventions for what could arguably be accomplished by behavioral change. And I say that with a massive asterisk, because I know we have had experts come on and talk about the intricacies of that, and it's not as simple as behavioral change. And okay, that's fair. Like, there is definitely a cultural issue baked into this. I think what you see happening, and I know this because I see it happening, is that now that there is a pharmaceutical solution available, soldiers will throw their hands up and forget about the behavioral change piece and just pursue the pill or the injection or whatever. So is it helpful? Yes, if your goal is to make the number on the scale go down, and then it becomes a MOPS and MOES conversation. Like, from a performative standpoint, sure, Ozempic will make you lose weight. Is it effective at addressing the actual root cause of the issue? I don't think so. But that's just me. I also, again, not being an Ozempic or whatever drug expert, I'm very cautious in terms of the long-term effects of this sort of thing. Is this something that we will look back at 50 years from now, like, oh my God, what were they doing in the early 2020s? Like, how crazy were those people? So I don't know. I mean, it markets well. It's super sexy, but I know that soldiers that are pursuing that sort of stuff have all kinds of behavioral and or lifestyle issues that should be addressed and aren't, because now we're offering the pill or the injection. That's just me.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would have to be sort of a hybrid approach, not just the drugs, but lifestyle changes. But it could be an accelerant to get people,
sure,
on the right path, like the fat camps or whatever they're called, prep camps at the Army, which I think worked largely, right? They've had the
future soldier prep courses. I mean, and that kind of stuff, again, I think is the Army's hand was sort of forced there. Like, the Army had to respond to what is inevitably true in culture, which is that people can't meet the standard. So we have to help them. And I think that's great. There are, as kind of a counterpoint to the point I just made, like, there are wickets that you have to go through as a soldier before you get to the actual pharmaceutical. But what I have noticed is that a lot of those wickets just become sort of like check the box admin type things. And they still get to that end point without actually having ever made the lifestyle change that you hope the pill or the injection would create.
So, to your knowledge, is DOD looking at this in any way, or the Army?
Mm-hmm.
So, to be clear, I promise the DOD is looking at it.
Yeah, it's in place. I mean, it's an option.
You can certainly get GLP-1 drugs through the VA as a veteran. It is possible to get it prescribed on active duty, but there's a bunch of wickets you have to get through.
Yeah,
and the conversation is whether to adjust those requirements to make it more accessible or not. I do want to say, because Drew raised a point that I hear all the time. Like, if you Google GLP-1s, everybody's going to say, like, oh, it seems like it's like easy and effective. And like, when we're like 20 years from now, we're going to learn that it was horrible. So I'm going to put Drew on the spot. Drew, when was the first GLP-1 receptor agonist drug developed?
See, this isn't fair because you're looking at the answer right now.
Guess it. When?
Guess? I'm going to go crazy to the left and say 1850.
So certainly not 1850. But everybody, because Ozempic and Wegovy have gone nuts in the media, everybody thinks that these drugs just came out like a year or two ago, and now it's going nuts. And like, yes, new versions and formulations have come out very recently that are a little more effective than previous versions and formulations. But like, the research stems back to the early 1980s.
As I said, 80s.
Yeah, like the first actual drug was isolated in 1992. Previous to that, it was just like work being done to try and isolate it. FDA, like patent application, was 1993. it goes through a long approval process to find out whether it's safe and effective. So the first FDA approval was 2005, which is still like 20 years ago now. So I think there has been more research on this stuff done than people realize. It's just that for a long time, these drugs were only prescribed to people with diabetes.
Correct. So they weren't being used, or I think even realized as a solution for weight loss. It was just
correct.
Okay.
They knew they caused or like related to weight loss, but that weight loss, like, they were trying to treat diabetes. They weren't trying to treat obesity. And the shift of allowing it just for obesity that's the recent phenomenon. And I think the DoD is certainly considering it. There's lots of reasons to have extra concerns for a DoD population. Some research indicates that you might lose a little bit more muscle and bone density if you are losing weight this way without exercise. So it's that much more important. Even if you're a civilian and you're taking these drugs, it's important to exercise and eat enough protein and stuff so you can preserve muscle and bone. But for a military population, it becomes even more important that they're also pairing it with the appropriate lifestyle stuff. And as we've said before, it's much easier to prescribe a pill than it is to get somebody to actually change their lifestyle.
But that's the thing for active duty military, they have to PT. So they're going to at least have to be doing PT.
For most active duty military.
You'd hope.
I think once you get outside traditional battalions and brigades and companies and things like that, and even if you go to like brigade staff or division staff, like you start to get a lot less frequency and consistency. It depends on the rank. When was the last time you saw a warrant officer at PT, all that stuff.
What's frustrating to me, and again, this is something we've sort of talked about a little bit, is like Ozempic, right? I mean, you mentioned early 90s, but like we have seen organizations like the VA hop on board with this and make it to where soldiers and veterans can access it. I guess under the auspices that weight loss is a priority for that population. I would argue the mental health epidemic is much greater of an issue for those same populations, but you don't see the same type of excitement around psychedelics and these sorts of alternative treatments that we have seen be very effective for those types of things. And that's coming from like, I am the last person in the world to know anything about psychedelics, but based on conversations Alex and I have had, it's a really interesting field of research for mental health. And I think you could make the argument that mental health is a bigger issue for those populations than obesity, but yet, and again, maybe because of the financial mechanisms at play, when you get to sort of big pharma, whatever, Ozempic and those types of drugs are almost getting fast tracked through some of those hurdles that some other options for some other issues don't get the same luxury.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, again, it's an easier thing to track, right? You can say, okay, now more people are eligible to join the military or to stay in the military because more people are meeting height and weight requirements. So,
and ironically, I think right now, if you've been prescribed these drugs as a civilian, you're like at least temporarily ineligible to enlist for a while. So we have an upcoming episode, hopefully, on accessions requirements for the military and medical waivers and things like that. So that's something we'll probably pop into the plan for the discussion there.
Okay. Well, as you said, we're at an hour and 21 minutes. Do you have any final thoughts for the audience as we wrap things up here?
Shameless plugs, mops_n_mose on Instagram. It's also on Facebook, but not as much. Mopsandmose.com is the website. You'll find training plans there. You'll find blog. You'll find all the podcast episodes. You can find us on any podcast app, Mops and Mose.
Mm-hmm.
What am I forgetting, Drew?
Yeah, if you hate what we say, send us hate mail. It's fine.
Any final words of inspiration to those out there struggling with their holistic health and fitness?
I would say a couple things. Some people might disagree with these. I don't know. One, on the strength and conditioning side, almost anything works as long as you do it consistently. So don't like overthink it and get frustrated and like try to find the perfect plan and waste time finding that plan. Get started now, just go do it. And then for the holistic health stuff, the internet can get confusing. What supplements should I take? Should I drink coffee right away in the morning or save it for an hour or never drink caffeine? Or like, are vegetables dangerous? Is fruit dangerous? Should I do low carb, high carb, low fat, high fat, keto, vegan, whatever? Like, there's a million things out there that make it really confusing. The way I like to say it is that the stuff your mom was probably telling you when you were 7 years old covers most of your bases. Eat your vegetables, get off the computer, get off the video games, go play outside, like social connection, all that. The basic stuff is going to treat you pretty well.
Yeah, I would agree with all that. The only thing I would add would be from like a behavioral standpoint, I think a lot of the hurdles that I see folks encounter when they sort of want to get into this kind of thing is thinking that they're all alone in that.
Mm,
And I think, it sounds a little bit sappy, but like truthfully, the majority of people have no idea what they're doing when it comes to health and performance, but doing something is better than doing nothing. And so don't be afraid to be the person that walks into the gym and has no clue, because I guarantee you're not the only one. And more often than not, there are people there, should be people there who are more than willing to help you,
mhm,
whether it's a virtual platform like ours or somebody who's there in person. But the worst thing that you could do is nothing. So something is better than anything. And like you mentioned, on the internet, there's a plethora of free knowledge, good, bad, or otherwise. Start with something. And as you sort of refine what you're doing, you'll find the right people to reach out to. And if it's us, great. Come to our website and we'll help you out. But the worst thing you can do is nothing, I think is what I would say.
Yeah, I think to give my advice on health and fitness is no matter what you do, just be consistent. Whatever it is,
Yeah.
keep doing it, and you'll see some sort of a
mhm.
result, whether or not it's the optimal one. But all
Boom.
right, well, Alex and Drew, thank you so much for joining us. You're doing important work. I'm going to keep an eye on some of the stuff you guys are doing personally, so no pressure there. And yeah, we appreciate your time. And to the audience, stay part time.